What if the most unbelievable murder you ever heard about was not a story, not a rumor, but something that actually happened? A case so shocking that even experienced investigators struggle to accept it as real. A crime that unfolded quietly without chaos, yet left devastation that could never be undone. This is one of those stories that forces you to question how well we truly know the people around us, and how quickly ordinary life can turn into something unthinkable. It began like any other day. The victim followed a familiar routine, the kind repeated so often it no longer required thought. Wake up, go to work, exchange polite words with strangers, plan for a future that seemed predictable and safe. There was nothing to suggest that this day would be different, that it would be the last page of a life that still had many chapters left to write. Somewhere else in the city, another person was awake with very different thoughts. While the world around them moved forward normally, their mind remained trapped in the past. A moment, an interaction, a perceived wrong, that most people would forget had taken root and grown darker over time. What started as frustration slowly transformed into obsession. An obsession, when left unchecked, can become dangerous. The paths of these two people crossed before, but not in a way anyone would consider significant. There was no dramatic argument, no public conflict, no visible threat. To outsiders, there was nothing connecting them strongly enough to explain what would eventually happen. That lack of clarity would later confuse investigators and shock the public. On the night of the murder, everything appeared calm. The location was ordinary, almost boring in its simplicity. Lights glowed softly, casting familiar shadows. People nearby went about their business, unaware that a life-altering event was unfolding just steps away. The victim was alone, focused on work, unaware of the danger approaching quietly. The killer arrived without drawing attention. There was no rush, no hesitation. Every movement suggested intention rather than impulse. This was not an act fueled by sudden anger. It was something rehearsed mentally many times before. Witnesses would later describe the suspect as calm, almost invisible, blending into the environment with ease. What happened next lasted only moments, yet its impact would stretch far beyond that night. There was no loud confrontation, no chance for escape. The act itself was swift and deliberate. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, it was already over. The victim never had the opportunity to understand why this was happening. When authorities arrived at the scene, they were met with silence. No signs of struggle, no obvious motive, no immediate answers. The scene told a story that felt incomplete, like a puzzle missing its most important pieces. Detectives searched for evidence that could explain why this person was targeted, but the usual clues were absent. As news of the murder spread, shock turned into disbelief. People who knew the victim described them as kind, reserved, and focused on living a simple life. There were no known enemies, no risky behavior, no involvement in anything that could explain such a violent end. The randomness of it all made the case even more disturbing. Investigators began reconstructing the final hours leading up to the crime. They analyzed movements, timelines, and every available detail. Surveillance footage from nearby areas provided fragments of information, small moments that slowly began to connect. A figure seen earlier, a pattern of behavior that suggested someone had been watching and waiting. As days turned into weeks, pressure mounted. The public demanded answers. How could something so extreme happen without warning? How could someone carry out such an act and vanish into the night? Detectives worked tirelessly, knowing that each unanswered question deepened the fear surrounding the case. Then came a breakthrough that shifted everything. A small detail, initially overlooked, suddenly gained significance. A connection, subtle but undeniable, began to emerge between the victim and a potential suspect. It wasn't dramatic, but it was enough to open a new direction in the investigation. When authorities identified a person of interest, those who knew them were stunned. This was not someone who fit the stereotype of a violent criminal. They had a normal life, a normal routine, and no history that suggested they were capable of such brutality. The idea that this person could be responsible felt impossible. But as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a hidden side, a pattern of fixation, unresolved resentment, and distorted thinking that had been building quietly over time. What looked normal on the surface concealed something far more dangerous underneath. The most shocking part was not just how the murder happened, but why. The motive, when finally understood, revealed how fragile the line can be between thought and action, how a single belief, left to grow without challenge, can lead someone to justify the unjustifiable. By the time the suspect was taken into custody, the case had already left a permanent mark. One life was gone forever. Another was about to be defined by a single decision, and countless others were left wondering how something so unbelievable could be real. But the story did not end with the arrest. In many ways, that was only the beginning. The arrest brought temporary relief, but it did not bring understanding. As the suspect sat in custody, investigators faced a haunting question. How did this happen without anyone noticing the warning signs? The person responsible did not appear dangerous. They did not live on the margins of society. They were someone people trusted, someone who smiled, spoke politely, and followed routines like everyone else. During questioning, the suspect's demeanor unsettled even experienced detectives. There was no visible breakdown, no dramatic confession. Instead, there was calm explanation, a rational tone used to describe an irrational act. It became clear that in the suspect's mind, the murder had been justified long before it happened. The motive, once fully revealed, shocked everyone involved. It was not driven by money, jealousy, or fear for survival. It stemmed from a perceived injustice, something the suspect believed had ruined their life. While the victim may not have even remembered the incident, the suspect had replayed it endlessly, allowing resentment to turn into purpose. Experts later explained how fixation can distort reality. When a person becomes trapped in their own narrative, they begin to see others not as human beings, but as symbols of their pain. In this case, the victim became that symbol. Once that transformation occurred, the act itself became easier to justify. The trial attracted intense attention. People wanted to understand how such a shocking crime could be real. Prosecutors presented a clear sequence of events, supported by evidence that left little room for doubt. The defense attempted to humanize the suspect, pointing to emotional struggles and mental strain, but the facts were difficult to ignore. What stood out most during the trial was the absence of chaos in the crime itself. There was no loss of control, no emotional explosion. Everything pointed to planning and intention. This forced jurors and observers to confront an uncomfortable truth. Some of the most terrifying acts are carried out calmly. When the verdict was delivered, it was met with quiet acceptance. There were no dramatic reactions, no sense of victory. Justice, in this case, felt heavy rather than satisfying. Nothing could undo what had been done. Nothing could return the life that was lost. For the victim's loved ones, the outcome provided answers, but not peace. Grief does not disappear with a sentence or a verdict. It lingers, reshaping everyday life in ways that are difficult to explain. They were left to carry memories forward, knowing that the future they once imagined had been stolen. In the aftermath, the case sparked broader conversations. People began questioning how well society understands warning signs, how easily obsession can hide behind normal behavior. The idea that someone capable of such violence could go unnoticed for so long was deeply unsettling. Professionals emphasized the importance of early intervention, communication, and awareness. Not every grievance leads to violence, but when someone becomes isolated within their own narrative, the risk increases. This case became an example used in discussions about prevention, not because it was typical, but because it was so shocking. Years later, the case is still remembered, not for graphic details, but for how unbelievable it felt. How something so extreme emerged from something so ordinary. How a quiet decision led to irreversible consequences. The location where the murder occurred returned to normal on the surface. People passed by without knowing the full story. Life moved on, as it always does. But for those who knew the truth, the memory remained vivid. This story serves as a reminder that reality can be more disturbing than fiction, that the most shocking crimes are not always loud or chaotic. Sometimes they happen quietly, driven by thoughts no one else can see. In the end, what makes this murder so hard to believe is not just what happened, but how easily it could have gone unnoticed. until it was too late. A single choice, made in silence, changed everything, and that is what makes this case real, unforgettable, and truly shocking.